you, Jenna. Thanks to everybody for joining, and again, a huge thanks to Jenna for putting this together. Jenna's ability to bring people together and organize events is totally incredible, and so thank you for what you do. Yeah, as Jenna said, I'm going to try to talk about 30 minutes. Actually, I'm going to start my timer right now because I don't want to go much longer than that, and give some big ideas from the book. Mainly big ideas, main ideas, but also bring in some details. But anything that I say, I have a lot more to say about it. So if you hear about something and I just kind of move through it quickly and you want to hear more, please ask about it. Glad to talk about it and add more detail. Sorry. Okay, so I want to give a little background on the book and the research behind it and how I came to write it. But first, actually, another quick thank you to, if you look at the acknowledgements in the book, the first people I put in there are the research participants, international students who worked on this project with me. I owe a massive thanks to them for working with me over multiple years and being very generous with me and sharing their lives with me for that period. And so a huge thanks to them. They have to go unnamed for research conventions, but really it would not be possible to write this book without all their generosity and what they shared with me. And also quick thanks to two other people, Nathan Thomas and Yusuf Oldak, who contributed blurbs to the back of the book, which I put on there. I really appreciate that, those kind words, and I hope the book lives up to them. So a little background about me. Most of my career has been in applied linguistics in TESOL, so a lot of teaching English to second language learners, international students, immigrant students, also some teaching abroad. And so that's the sort of biggest context for my work with international students over the years. And in more recent years, mainly focused on teaching the teaching of writing. And so about 12 or 13 years ago, I was teaching a lot of writing classes for international students. And a couple of colleagues of mine who are also teaching those kind of classes for international students decided to put together an event for our colleagues in our Department of Writing, to our colleagues who didn't necessarily work with international students and weren't trained in doing that work, but sometimes had multilingual students in their classes. So we wanted to do a session to kind of give them some ideas of how they could support these students. And we did that. And the way we set it up is the two faculty members, two colleagues and I, the three of us talked for about 30 minutes about some of what we do and our ideas and approaches that we think are effective. And then we had three international students who agreed to join us that day and talk to the group of faculty. International undergraduate students talk about their experiences learning how to write at our college. And then as they talked about this, they also talked about other classes they were taking. They talked about their lives in the US at those moments and how all these things were kind of intersecting for them and what was going on. And I sat there and listened with other faculty, and it was really just totally incredible to listen to these students bravely kind of talk about themselves and their experiences in front of a room of faculty. And I left that event thinking about two things. I mean, one thing was I learned some things from that event about how I could be a better teacher of writing for international students. They said some things that I hadn't thought about or didn't know about before that helped me rethink my pedagogy in teaching writing to those students. But the bigger picture, what I took away from it was that I realized I wasn't really listening to my students enough. And I was listening to them in our classes. We'd have discussions. I listened when they came to my office and we talked one-on-one about their papers they were working on. I'd listen to them and look at their arguments, maybe talk about grammar. But I wasn't really doing this bigger kind of listening that had happened at that event, where students just had a space to kind of talk about where they were, what was going on, both in their academic lives and more broadly. So I felt like I wanted to create a space where I could make that happen. So that was kind of what led to the beginning of the research project behind this book. And I had a couple models from applied linguistics. So Bonnie Norton, a researcher who's done amazing work around identity and language learning, did a project with a group of immigrant women in Canada for some years. And that was kind of a model. So working with a small number of participants over a long time. Another was Alana Leckie, expert in second language writing, who wrote a book working with 4 multilingual writers in US college over 4 years. So those were kind of the inspirations for me to try to develop a project where I could work with a qualitative project working with a small number of students over a long period of time. And so that's what I did. And I recruited 9 students who wanted to join the study. And my goal was to start working with them when they started college, and work with them all through college and kind of follow their path as they went through the whole college journey. I'll say more about the details of participants and how that worked out in a few minutes. But that was kind of the model, and mainly based on interviews and doing recurring interviews with these students over time. And at that moment, because of my disciplinary grounding, I was thinking about writing. I really wanted to focus on how these students were developing their English writing skills during college. And I wanted to connect that to other things, but my thinking was that writing and language learning and writing were the center. And that's kind of where I started. But as I worked with these students and met with them multiple times, interviewed them, and we started talking more, and they opened up to me more, I soon, at least after a year, came to realize that the writing thing was not really that important to them in the big picture. And it was actually a pretty small piece of the puzzle of their lives as international students. So I at that time, reoriented the research to think much more broadly. I was still interested in writing, and I do write some about writing in the book, and I'll talk about that some today. But became more interested in these sort of larger picture of their experiences, what it meant for them to be international students at a U.S. university at that time, and how they were experiencing that. So that was ended up being what led to the book. So one more thing I want to say, while that image is there of the cover, when was going through the final stages of publication preparation, the publisher told me they gave me access to a couple databases, massive databases of images I could look at, maybe find some suggestions what could be the cover image. There's a lot of stuff in there, and I came across this one, and I was like, oh, that's it. That's the book. So this image of a student, a young woman, going, as I see it, kind of going into the world of the university. She's doing this alone, but there's other students out there. There's these big buildings, the structure of the institution. And so really trying to think about what this experience means for her, meant for the students doing this. And also I like that when we look at this image, the vantage point is we're trying to see what she sees as she goes forward. And we can't really see it from her point of view, but we're trying best to kind of appreciate how it looks from her point of view. So I was glad that ended up being something that worked they could use for the book. Okay, a little more details about the project and background. So as I kind of explained, it's a longitudinal project. Talk about them as qualitative case studies. I use the plural case studies there because I think about these 9 different students as sort of different studies of individuals in a similar space. But we could also think about the whole thing as a study of what it meant to be an international student in this place at time, and what that felt like. But I do focus a lot on individual stories, overlapping, but also individuals. So I think about them as, these are plural, there's case studies. As I said, 9 students, international undergraduate students, started working with me. I'll say in a minute. So some of the students did work with me over 4 years, pretty much all through college, but not all of them. They had different situations. Some left the university, a couple pulled out of the study. So it's different for each student. Details about that in a second. But I'll also say here, there's good conversation, discussion within the field of international education about, whether we should even use what it means to use the phrase international students, and how that can sometimes be problematic. I think those are good conversations. I engage with them some, but ultimately I kind of try to explain why I use it and how I use it, and trying to define it in a very specific way for the research participants in the book. So time frame, as I said, 4 years, starting in 2015 to 2019. And then the 2024 there, because what I did last year is, after I was very far along in the project working on the book, I wanted to reach out to these same research participants and see if I could learn about their lives after college, 5 years after. How are their lives developed since the last time I saw them when they were leaving college, or some, again, they even left college earlier. So I was able to reconnect with 6 of the 9 students, do an interview with them, and that's actually the next to last chapter of the book, kind of telling their stories of where they ended up 5 years after college. So that was a wonderful experience for me, I'll say, to be able to reconnect with those students. So in total, data, mainly interviews, that's the main thing I draw from, 64 interviews in all. I did collect a lot of student writing, because again, that's where I started, and I kept with that to some extent. So a lot of artifacts of student writing, and then I did do 3 interviews with faculty who had worked with the students. So just to add here, the way I kind of wrote the book, and what I'm trying to do is bring together storytelling what I learned from the students, vignettes, kind of what they went through, together with theoretical discussions about issues that seem relevant to what I was learning, and sort of engaging with others doing overlapping or similar kinds of research. So I try to balance those two in the book. I mean, certain areas maybe more of one or more than the other, but that was my aim, to try to bring together these really grounded stories with larger theoretical discussions, and drawing on stories to kind of interact with theoretical conversations. I just want to highlight this here. A wonderful quote for me from this chapter by Fedberg that I've gone back to a lot over the years and working on different kinds of case studies, explanation of case study research. So ways explained here is thinking about case studies as a virtual reality for readers willing to enter this reality and explore it inside and out. The payback is meant to be a sensitivity to the issues at hand that cannot be obtained from theory. So the phrase for me that I love there is a sensitivity to the issues at hand. I really think that's what we can get from case studies, even case studies of individuals, is obviously you can't do a kind of generalization as you can with other research, but if you go deep into these stories, into these cases, and try to understand them in very contextual ways, I think you can gain new kinds of sensitivity, which I agree we don't get from theory. We need theory too, but we get something different from theory. So that's kind of a way this inspired me to think about the kind of work that I share in this book. A little more detail about the participants. You'll see there a pretty good mix in some ways. I mean, their countries of origin, by the way, these are all pseudonyms, as it says. The countries of origin, that was not necessarily like a cross-section of who was at this institution in the US where these students were, but more sort of who volunteered and wanted to participate in the study and work with me. And you'll see there it says number of interviews. So the students, the first 4 were the ones that pretty much all through college I was able to work with them and follow their stories. And so they get more attention overall in the book because it's really amazing to have 4 years of work with someone, a student, and you can see so much change. And that's really important to what I'm doing in the book, is trying to understand change over time. But I do draw something from all the students, and they all have a place in there. And the ones who are there for shorter periods, I said, is sort of for different reasons. Some people left the university early, a couple people pulled out of the study, so that varied. And as I said, I was able to reconnect with 6 students last year to hear more about their lives, or hear about their lives in the years after college. So the big themes I'm looking at, I mainly organized the book around 3 big themes, and then I have research questions that are in the book that in my mind, kind of connect to specific themes mainly. So the biggest one is part of the subtitle, Case Studies and Agency, is probably agency that I think runs through the book in the biggest way. And just a few words here about that. I mean, when I talk about agency, I'm very clear about I'm not working in some sort of romantic idea of agency that people are sort of free floating and can do what they want, but always trying to situate agency in relation to structure, in relation to environmental factors, and how these students were kind of working to be agentive, to do the things they felt were right for them, that they wanted to do, to follow their own goals, but always in the situations in which they found themselves, which sometimes seemed to support their desires and goals, what they wanted to do, and sometimes made it a lot more difficult for them to figure out how they could assert that agency. But I mean, in the end, I'm trying to focus on the agency side, but I'm always kind of putting it in context, in place of other forces that they're working within. Identity, I'm going to say more about that actually in a little bit here. I'm going to focus on that theme in a little more detail. But I mean, identity and agency definitely overlap. It divided them because it helps the organization, but also I think they help us focus on different things, but they're very much overlapping too. But I'll say a little more about that in a few minutes. And the third one, their motivation, I think it's the least attention in work with international students. Typically, motivation gets talked about in terms of students' motivations for studying abroad, so why they decide to go abroad to study, and I do talk about that. But my main focus on motivation here is about the kinds of motivation students experienced as they went through college. So that's academic motivation, definitely, and how that changed over time in reaction to various factors, and motivation in other parts of life, for example, professional orientation kind of motivations. So here I draw heavily on psychology, self-determination theory, the idea of autonomy from that theory, and also extrinsic motivation, and also draw a lot on an idea from psychology of possible future selves. So thinking about how people develop ideas about who they want to be in the future or who they don't want to be, and how that shapes choices in the present. So trying to understand how that played out and some of the choices and decisions students were making as they went through college. So I'm not going to say more about that today, but I'm glad to talk about it more. And of course, it's in the book if that's interesting to you. Here's a table of contents. I just want to say that if you pick up the book and you read chapter 1 and you think this is really boring, it's a bunch of theory, please stick with it, because chapter 1 is definitely a lot of theory. I'm doing a lot of framing, trying to explain, talking about methods, but also talking about the big ideas, those 3 themes and others that are kind of driving the work. And I don't actually do any storytelling in number 1, but if you make it to chapter 2 and all the other chapters, you will see a lot more of the students there. And again, basically what I'm doing in the chapters in each case is trying to connect certain theoretical orientations, ideas, concepts to the data that I gathered, and trying to understand, interpret students' stories in relation to those ideas. And then chapter 6, from possible self to actual self lifetime for college, is the one that's really just storytelling of what I learned from the students, how their lives developed 5 years after college, and then trying to connect that back to some of the things they told me about earlier, and make connections. And bringing back these themes, the way I tried to organize it was that those 3 central chapters, each of them really focuses mainly on one of those big ideas, those big themes. So again, it's not that simple. They overlap and they work throughout the book in different ways, but I tried to make chapter 3 really focused on agency, 4 about identity, 5 about motivation, most directly anyway. So I would say that, for example, if you were to have access to this book as an ebook through your academic library, it's very easy to, if you're really interested in motivation, international students, or identity, it's really easy to sort of move into a chapter quickly and, see what I have to share there. I tried to write those chapters in ways that you could enter them, and, I think get a lot out of them, even if you don't have the others, but I mean, the others help a lot too. But I tried to make them so you could get into those themes, sorry, within the scope of those chapters. And then I want to add one more here, just an idea I call alignment, which I develop throughout the book, and that I sort of came to after a lot of years really of working with this data, the interview data mainly. And this is my effort to try to explain what I think was happening overall. It kind of relates to structure and agency, but try to understand how the students were doing agentive work, trying to, but always again within situations that may have been more or less supporting. So the way I define it toward the beginning of the book in chapter 1, alignment is a process by which the students work to align their internal drives and desires with a wide range of external conditions, so that they could transform self-defined goals into reality, to actively negotiate the space between what they wanted for themselves and what seemed possible within a specific set of real-world conditions. So again, really trying to understand. So the starting point, it says at the top there, sort of working from assumption that students always arrive with their own ideas about who they are, who they want to be, what they're doing, their goals for learning, their goals for life. That's kind of the starting point. But then also recognizing those have to somehow move into real spaces and context, which again may be supportive and may not be supportive. So how do students work to negotiate that space? And it varies very much by situation, by student. But that's what I'm trying to get at there, is trying to understand, describe that process and see how that played out, different things across the research. Okay, so I kind of talk about that, sorry, at the beginning of the book, and I try to weave it throughout and come back to at the end, the final chapter is kind of a theoretical wrap up, and try to explain again how I think it's working there. Okay, I'm going to spend the next few slides focusing. I thought I'd just pull out one chapter to give more detail about something, and that chapter 4, which is focused on identity. And the model I have here is kind of what I do in those chapters, kind of set up some theoretical frames, some ideas I'm working with, and then apply that and bring that to the work with students. So as far as the identity chapter, big ideas is definitely, generally working within postmodern ideas about identity, which are pretty commonplace now in academic discussions of identity anyway. So thinking of identity is not fixed, not singular, but multiple, complex, negotiated, performed. So kind of working generally within that frame. And then Anthony Giddens talks about self-identity and the idea of the internal narrative. So for him, a big part of what we do with identity is we develop our own stories about who we are, who we want to be. As I said, they're created and sustained in the reflective activities of the individual. So that's very much about the internal side of identity that we do ourselves in our own ways. But more generally, as part of this, more recent postmodern ways of thinking about identity, and Simon Marginson kind of highlights this nicely. Our identity is not just what we call ourselves, but it's also what others call us. So it's always there is the internal narrative, but there's also the world around us that is putting us in categories, calling us things, telling us who we are, who we aren't, and so that's an important part of the story too. And then two studies here focused on international students that were very helpful to me in trying to think about identity in terms of my research were a Carmon and Christian study on Muslim women in the US, students in the US. So these were women who were studying at university in the US in a very conservative area, part of the country, during a time, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when there's a lot of anti-Islamic discourse that was coming louder in the US. And so they found themselves in a situation where they were struggling to figure out how they wanted to perform those identities in the spaces of the university. So one question for the women was whether or not they would wear a hijab on campus. And different women made different choices as we learned in the research. But one woman from Saudi Arabia talks about, and when she wore a hijab to class, she noticed no one would sit close to her. So really, what this highlights for me is kind of, how these women had to negotiate that internal narrative with the external pressures and the ideologies that were around them, and what kind of choices they decided to make. And sometimes those are choices about, what made them feel safe. And so that's kind of working at that space between those two forces. We study of Singaporean women in the UK, different, but I think highlights something similar. So she talks about how these women decided to perform their identities in 3 different kinds of spaces. And so, for example, in very public spaces, they may have decided not to share their identities. They may even felt threatened in some cases. But in very private spaces, like their dorm rooms or the apartments they were living in, they felt very comfortable, doing that, making that internal narrative, bringing it out. Even we talks about what they do in the way they design their rooms. So again, sort of how different external realities sort of shape how people decide what they decide to do with that internal story, and share it, not share it, curate it. And that's kind of, I think, the big idea in the title of the chapter, between self and performance. What I'm trying to get at is, how do individual students, these students I work with, how are they kind of working in the space? What choices did they make? What influenced those choices, and how do they feel about those choices? So I'm going to share a few of those stories here from that chapter that get at that issue. So I look at identity there in terms of a couple different things. So one is in terms of the academic writing, because within field of writing studies, rhetoric and composition, there's a lot of focus on how writing is a site through which students perform identity, and both for L1 writers and second language writers, multilingual students. So at the top there I have, the way this can often happen is when students kind of explore issues of personal interest, they share views on issues in the world, issues of public debate, and they also present their self-narratives and community narratives to the academic world around them, professors, their peers. That's kind of the traditional way that most students kind of perform identity through writing. So a great example of this was from Khaled, a student from a Persian Gulf country who talked to me about, writing his papers and for classes in college. And as he said there, this really wonderful quote, when he wrote a paper, he said, depending on the class, it always intersects with who I am. He says, I can write a paper, does not have anything to do with me, but it became a mission of how I wanted people to see people who are from my background. So what I really appreciate about that is, one, he's doing this identity work. He wants to share his own version of himself with others, but he also sees it as a chance to sort of his story, but also the story of, as he says, people who are from his background. And a great example of this was he told me about and shared a paper with me he wrote for, I think it was a class about popular music. And he wrote a paper about Kendrick Lamar's song called The Blacker the Berry, which is basically about anti-Black racism in the US. And Khaled really identified with this. So he identified himself as a Black Arab, and he had faced racism in his own life, in his past. And he was now discovering kind of new racism in the US based on his identity. And he really connected with this song. So in writing about it and writing his paper about it, he was doing this performance of his own self-narrative and kind of finding a way, a new context in which to share that with people around him in his new environment. And that was definitely kind of agentive work at the level of writing. So there's one writing story, and here's another one about writing from Aneta, who was from Poland. And Aneta was a student who actually worked with her, had the most interviews with her over the years. She was a student who was very motivated and loved to work very hard on classes that were about things she liked. Like she was a graphic designer. She loved to do graphic design projects. She was so excited and motivated and worked very hard on those. She was quite a bit less motivated in classes that were not about things she liked. So when she had to take her writing class, her first year of college, this was not an exciting class to her. And she was asked to had developed some kind of paper around like a controversial topic or something. So she decided to write about gender equality, and the name of her paper was Gender Equality, Are We Going the Right Direction? And Aneta's answer was basically, no, we're not going the right direction. And she was kind of arguing for a more traditional kind of understanding of gender roles. And as she said it to me during one conversation, we talked about this a couple times actually over the years, but one time she said to me when she wrote the paper, she said she was just trying to express her point of view. My point of view is from Poland, so this is why I just talked about it, because I have a different view a little bit than people here. So her ideological position is very different than Kala's, but she's doing the same kind of thing, where she feels like she's doing this work that allows her to express who she is, and for her, it connects to what she sees as part of a cultural background. I'll just say as an aside, I lived in Poland for several years, and I'm very connected with the Polish culture, and Aneta's view is definitely one view that exists in Poland, but it's complicated. There's lots of varying views on gender equality in Poland for sure. But this was a view that was important to her and that she felt connected to her culture. So that's a kind of identity performance. But what was interesting about this specific paper with Aneta is we talked about it at one point shortly after she'd written it, and then a couple of years later, I talked to her about it again, and which is a great thing, by the way, about working with students over time. I mean, you get a chance to kind of revisit things and see how their own thoughts and experience have changed. And she told me that, again, she said she didn't really like the class. She just had to write some kind of paper. She wanted to get it done. And then maybe there was some of this, her doing this community identity work. But she also told me about how when she was growing up, her dad had worked a night shift in a job. And so he was gone every night and he slept during the day. And then her mom would work during the day. And she felt very lonely a lot. And she felt that she had really missed a lot of time she could have had with her mom that she didn't get. And that was part of what shaped her view about why she thought it was an important goal for moms to be able to spend more time with their kids at home. So I don't know if that, I'm not saying that changes the political orientation of what she was saying, but I think, through that kind of developing trust with people and spending time, stories become a lot more complicated and multidimensional. And that was something I appreciated that I could learn about what that paper meant for her and where it was coming from and how it related to her own personal story and identity in ways that I didn't see before. And then I say at the bottom there, and that's just changing identity performances. I mean, this was one moment for her, that paper during her first year of college. As she went through college and started doing more of those courses she cared about, she got really excited about stuff she wrote, and she put her identity, her self-identity into it in different ways. And she was very motivated and engaged, even if that paper wasn't a time where she was excited or was doing the same kind of work. Okay, that was some writing stuff. I'm gonna watch the time here. I'm gonna share a couple more here quickly that were not about writing, but another thing I talk about in that chapter is identity in relation to home culture, community, and both in relation to members of the home culture in the US at that time. So like other international students or community or immigrant communities in the area, depending on the student. And sort of both those as sites, or that, and also relationships with people back home, and how those are two kind of sites where students were negotiating identity in overlapping but a little bit different ways. So in the case of Tao from China, he had a complicated situation in that he told me that he didn't feel connected to the other Chinese students that were at the university. And he told me that he came from a background, from a rural agricultural background, a very big class difference between him and other students he had met. He was from an ethnic minority in China. He didn't feel like he could connect with the other students in the US, other Chinese students. He even avoided them, he told me. and over time, he also told me about how his connections with friends and family back home were becoming complicated because, and that's what this quote is from, because he felt less and less connected to them and felt less and less able to kind of communicate with them clearly. So he said about friends and family back home, they just treat me differently, like I'm a foreigner rather than one of their own. I feel like I'm always myself. Like I really don't want to say I'm Chinese or I'm American. I'm just myself, but I'm acting in too, they think I'm acting too foreign away. It's their problem, yeah. So I wouldn't worry about it. So it's kind of like a, a difficult place that he found himself in, and he was kind of resolved. And other students told me something similar. Actually, they had to sort of, um, basically cut off some relations with people back home because they couldn't. They felt like they were being rejected by those people. They didn't know how to interact with them. So this was not uncommon, but this was kind of an extreme version of it. But again, he kind of had a resolve about it, and sort of being who he believed he was. So in terms of this negotiating the space, to me, he kind of developed his own self narrative about who he was, and he was going to do that thing. And even though he realized this was not, this was going to probably make him have to break some social ties or some connections he had had. Okay, one more quick one here. I mean, those stories, at least the last two are sort of versions of a struggle, trying to figure out how to negotiate this difficult space when you don't know, when you feel like whatever that internal narrative is being resisted in some way or isn't comfortable with people around you. Sayefma from Nigeria told me a really positive story, which I put it here. It's also at the end of that chapter about how she was negotiating the relationship and her identity that she was developing in the U.S. with her identity and relationships back home. So, and for her, the way she presented to me, it wasn't really a struggle, but she was just trying to figure out how to make these things coexist together comfortably. So here's what she says: once you live abroad, once you go back, when you go back, you see things different. You'll be like, wow, is that really how people think? Is this really how people think? How they're thinking is bad. But you try because of how exposed you are, because of how you could actually switch in two different thinkings at once. You actually see things and be like, if I'm here, like, I get what you're saying. You're trying to analyze things in a different way. I get your point. So the phrase I love there that is really wonderful is, for me, switch into two different thinkings at once. So that's kind of the strategy she developed for herself to, again, allow these two cultural worlds, identity worlds, to kind of coexist for her in a way that felt okay. She was very proud of her heritage and her background. She wasn't going to let go of any of that, but she was also excited about the new identity she was able to develop in the U.S. So to me, she found a way to kind of make these work together. Okay, a few stories there, and I'm gonna wrap it up here. Just this is a line from last page of the book where I try to say in a really big picture what I'm up to. So I think the book contributes an unambiguous appreciation for students as multifaceted, self-determined actors, an argument for the importance of recognizing their efforts to align internal desires with external conditions. Um, it embraces the idea that we need to complement macro-level analyses with grounded views on student experiences, which are always in the end stories of agency. So I said earlier, I don't like have a romanticized, try not to have a romanticized view on agency, try to replace it in context of structure. This last line, I probably get the most romantic about it, but I did learn this as I went through the project, and it's something that it left me with, is appreciating more, again, something I didn't appreciate just from a teaching point of view, and not until I became just really a listener, that all the dimensions of agency I wasn't seeing, and I think we often don't see, and I know for these students that don't get seen by people around them, by their professors, by administrators, by peers, and how even when it might not have looked like students were asserting agency, they were. And just because others couldn't see it, I couldn't see it, doesn't mean it wasn't happening. So I came to sort of really appreciate that there were always agentive actions going on, sometimes successful, sometimes less successful, but they were always there. And I really, really appreciated that. Something I walked away with. Okay. Yeah, I want to have here, there's the book cover again. The publisher sent me a discount code that you can use. It's right there. It's valid for like a month. I think it's for the book, the ebook. I'm going to paste that, sorry, in the chat, same thing. But just keep that in mind. And it could be if you're at an academic institution, I can expect, it may be something your library could think about getting to if you think it'd be interesting to you and colleagues and students or for whomever. Okay, that's what's I wanted to say. Should I close that, Jen? Is that stop share?
Yeah, great. I'll just stop the
Okay.
recording.